Today's guest is Craig Webb. He's the president at Webb Analytics. Craig, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you much. I appreciate it.
Great. I love your background. Um, you have a lot of knowledge in sort of the building materials, distribution, construction, all that stuff. I love that area. How did you come across that area?
Well, just luck, actually. I started out life as a sports writer in South Bend, Indiana, went to college, and knew that I wanted to be a journalist even in high school. And so then I spent the next 50 years of my life as a reporter and a collector of information. About 18 years ago, an opportunity came to become editor of the biggest and most prestigious magazine for lumber yards in the United States. It was called Pro Sales. Uh, and I worked there for 12 years. And for 5 of those years, I also was editor in chief of one of the biggest magazines for remodelers called Remodeling Magazine. Uh, 6 years ago, journalism started to have its problems, and I could tell that the people who owned the company were not really very interested in pursuing growth in the press. So I reached out and found some help and created Webb Analytics. But largely, it's still the same thing. It's all about collecting information and finding the trends and the threats and the opportunities that are facing the construction supply chain. Everybody from the factory to the job site, and I help spot those issues and then figure out ways to help my customers solve them and get ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at some of your articles. We talked before as well. I know one of the more recent ones you were talking about is DEI and sort of sustainability initiatives sort of at risk at some of these companies. What are your thoughts there?
Well, in many ways, building material dealers are very open-minded people. they they want you to work hard, and as long as you're willing to work hard and put in some muscle and sweat a little bit, they really don't care if you went to college. And for the most part, they don't really make a big deal about your gender or your racial identity. At the same time, this is largely because it's a relationship business. It's been built on relations. And, there's a long history of people hiring people that they used to play high school football with. So if you don't have a girl on a football team or your high school didn't have people of other backgrounds, you didn't necessarily find those people or get them interested. There is not much interest in working in an outside job where you're doing a lot of what people consider dirty manual labor, which is how you start out in the construction supply business. And consequently, it doesn't necessarily attract a lot of people. And that lack of attraction is another factor that causes a need for people to be looking outside their normal environments, which is theoretically what DEI is about. Um, DEI, I know, also has been criticized for favoring one applicant over another. But in an industry like construction supply, where getting people to apply to begin with is a challenge, I think DEI takes on a whole different aspect.
Yeah, I guess it's a definition for some, you know, because I guess the DI efforts in this regard is extremely practical in terms of moving business objectives.
Right. I agree. And also, it has to be remembered that in an industry in which a huge percentage of the workers are Hispanic, DEI sort of takes care of itself because if you're running a lumber yard, you want somebody who speaks Spanish. So you do have that. Also, in terms of the inclusion and equity, it is interesting to see an increasing number of women coming into the industry. Sometimes at the top because they're the daughters of the owners, but frequently in other ways. They're people who are in jobs that have traditionally been inside jobs are starting to move up into management. And you're starting to see a few more cases of people, women getting into some of the more traditional jobs like sales reps.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. So for you, I mean, you were talking about Tractor Supply and what they were doing. Um, how do you see this going in the future? I mean, is it just a communication challenge, or is something need to be restructured on how these are delivered, or I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I want to take this in two directions. The first is that uh, the whole DEI movement has gotten a lot of its propulsion from pressure, as well as sometimes semi regulations being placed on public companies, stock held companies. Well, very few companies in construction supply are public companies. Just about all of them are private. So, in a sense, you have very few DEI reports coming out of construction supply because they don't have to issue them. And so, what's the effect of this? Probably not much, in the sense that it always was more, the whole idea of diversity, equity, inclusion in construction supply is almost more of a moral objective and sometimes an employment objective, as opposed to being a regulatory or a will the stockholders love me objective. Now, that's part one of this. I want to point out another thing that involved Tractor Supply, and that is they also, aside from dropping DEI, they also were dropping their carbon goals, their carbon emission goals. And this gets into the whole issue of sustainability. And that is something that probably affects all construction supply in a much more profound way than DEI ever did. And I think is that is sort of the unreported part of the whole tractor supply issue that I think people need to think a lot more about.
Yeah. I mean, for us, sustainability is very important, but not sustainability for the sake of sustainability. I think, as a building manufacturer, I think making the economic case very strong, or the performance case very strong, is very important to push wholesale change. So, yeah, I applaud the effort to move in that direction, but I think, you know, if the materials or the other things are just not at that commercial competitiveness, that you just can't really expect anything, yeah, to really take hold.
That's true, although the notion is, how do we get toward a world in which our products are more recyclable, in which our products are more useful? And one of the more interesting things that I'm seeing around the world is an initiative in Europe to make products more repairable and replaceable. In fact, if you talk to, there are initiatives in the European Union basically to demand that companies provide ways to fix the products they sell,
Mm.
so that the products will last longer. There's even a movement sometimes to take back the products after they've been used by one group so that they can be sold to other people. That's a whole different sort of returns policy that construction supply companies could be involved in. And then also this, just the general demand that you look more closely at what's going on in terms of producing products, so that you just at least can measure what your carbon output is. And that's something that's happening in Europe, but it's also happening in California, might be happening in Japan as well. Some of the biggest construction supply companies in the world are now working together to try to measure their carbon output and the carbon output of the products that they sell. So I think that's an effort that we are seeing that unfortunately Tractor Supply doesn't seem interested in pursuing.
Got it. And I'm wondering, like, when you mentioned repairability and stuff, I did not think of that as you were, as I first brought it up. I'm wondering how much of that, and maybe that's not the case with Tractor Supply, but how much of that is the education around that information?
Well, I think education does factor in greatly in order to get people to think about things. And it's you know, the way we do things right now are so create such profound challenges that we almost have to get back to zero. I was listening to a National Public Radio reporter this morning talk about her efforts to go a week without using plastic. And she just basically said, if you want to get a prescription at a pharmacy, it's not like they'll just hand you a handful of pills. If you want to get if you want to get walnuts or something like that, you might be able to fill them up in bulk, but sometimes no. The only way you can get those are in a certain way. Once upon a time, we sold nails and screws one at a time. You would get a pound of nails or a handful of nails. We've gone way beyond that with plastic packaging for quite a while. Will we ever go back, maybe, to the notion of selling a pound of nails? Maybe. And think of all the plastic all those blister packs we'd get rid of if we did that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely, it's interesting, and I'm wondering with some of this packaging, especially related to supply chain, depending on the products, sometimes they, still have a net benefit, so I think looking at it from sort of a wider lens sometimes it requires so that you don't have an unintended sort of consequence of trying to reduce, sort of an effect on the world, but causing a bigger problem by just looking at it too narrowly.
Well, and I can understand why, for example, you have blister packs. You have blister packs because you can hang them up on pegboards and create planograms. If you just have it all in bulk, it's all lying on the floor. And so, you're trying to solve one problem, which is to make your store more efficient, and in effect, you're creating another problem.
There you go. Love the challenge. Speaking about companies, and what I notice is just a lot more consolidation around the industry, especially the building material supply side. Um, since you've been, covering this in various ways for a long time, you've probably seen sort of the ups and downs of that, the consolidation and sort of breaking apart that. Um, Tell me what you see in that area right now, because there seems to be a lot of companies coming together.
Well, that's been going on for the entire time I've been in the business. When I first started in 2006, that was just about the same time as a company called ProBuild was created. ProBuild actually is the combination of more than 50 or 60 different companies that had been acquired just before then by a couple of other operations that then merged. At the same time, the stock building supply was a huge grower and consolidator of companies. Now, what was ProBuild, what was Stock Building Supply, what was Building Materials Corporation, have all been merged into one mega company called Builders First Source. So it's been going on for years and years and years. Um, what you and in fact, even now, people tend to think about the mega mergers that we've heard about, the most recent one being the Home Depot purchasing SRS distribution for about $18 billion. That picked up 769 new branches at the Home Depot that they theoretically can use. That's an outlier. Most purchases, most acquisitions you see in the United States are of a building material dealer buying a store one county over. There's a huge number of people who knew each other who just add on, and so what used to be a one store operation becomes a three or a five or an eight store operation. Um, Bigger than that, they do exist, but not so many, and it starts getting more complicated. And that's really the consolidation we've got going on.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, yeah, the bigger ones get the attention, but the smaller ones are the bulk of it. But looking at like SRS and Home Depot, which kind of are, in my view, a little different. What did Home Depot see in SRS? Because they're not quite selling to the same customer, or are they?
Well, you are right. They're not quite selling to the same customer. So, one advantage of what Home Depot got was a whole new audience that increased its addressable market by $50 billion. They were a $950 billion addressable market. Now they're a $1 trillion addressable market, is the way they measure it. But um, it also works out in several other ways. One of the most interesting ones is that SRS actually is three companies in one. It sells roofing, but it also has a division that's devoted to landscaping, and it has a third division it created that's devoted to pool supplies. And in each of these cases, what happened is the people at SRS identified a vertical that they could get into, thought about what it would take to get into it, started buying companies, and as they were buying them, did a great job of integrating them into the same computer system and getting everything running right from the start. So, if you're the Home Depot and you've decided that you want to get into a new business, uh, you basically have in SRS this vehicle that knows how to identify and then take over a vertical. And each time you can just replicate what SRS is doing into new areas. That's part one. The second thing is that the Home Depot, the Home Depot didn't have that experience because they really weren't much in the business of acquisition. They were in the business of growing their own stores. The second thing that they weren't in the business of doing is giving trade credit, letting you buy on time. They had credit cards and stuff like that, but they did not have the kind of complicated trade credit that you see commercial companies and home builders use and the like. SRS had a lot of experience in that, to the extent that when the Home Depot bought them, they said maybe we'll just have SRS take over all the trade credit for all of the Home Depot because they've got experience at it. Whether that happens, I don't know. But the bottom line is that the Home Depot was buying, in some ways, a box of possibilities, as well as an existing company when they took over SRS.
Hmm, interesting. Um, um, with some of the other distributors, I know Beacon, ABC. You mentioned Beacon is pushing into waterproofing, ABC pushing into solar. I mean, what do you see there? Successes, setbacks. What are your thoughts on their sort of?
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
one of the interesting things that came out of some initial surveys I've seen about the Home Depot deal was a question asked of roofers that if you're if you're using Beacon or ABC now that Home Depot's bought it, are you thinking of moving over? And the answer is nobody said they were going to move. If they were a Beacon customer, they'd stick with Beacon. If they were ABC, they'd stick with ABC. And SRS the same. So in other words, it's not moving the mark. And truthfully, Beacon and ABC are, through a combination of purchases and greenfields, expanding faster. SRS is actually the third biggest company in roofing. It's not the first. And so, you do get into those issues too. I mean, if you're, Jack Welch at, where was he? GE. His notion was is that if you're not in first or second place, you should get out of the business. Well, here we got Home Depot going in the opposite direction. So they must have been buying it for other reasons, which I've mentioned. The roofing space is a phenomenally competitive space. All three of those guys are going at it, roofing, hammer and tong, and the people who are probably hurting the most are everybody in fourth place on down.
yeah, sure. What other sort of trends in the industry have you been collecting information on?
Well, aside from openings and closures and the like, I'm also looking at operational improvements and what people are doing. Uh, there are people looking at artificial intelligence in a number of different ways. Some of the basic ones right now are in marketing. You use it to help write some emails to your customers or extra copy for your website, that sort of stuff. Nothing really spectacular. But there are companies out there that are starting to get attention in the construction supply world with regard to how they help you run your business better. For example, how to price your products better so that you come up with individual prices for each and every one of your products based on each and every one of your customers and what they like. Others have to do with purchasing styles. Some have to do with keeping track of your inventory. All of those things are coming together. And then a fourth one, which in some ways is the most practical of all, is that artificial intelligence can help you clean up your data and take care of all the duplicates you've got sitting around and all the mistakes you've got sitting around. I've talked in general over the years about how we are heading toward a Hot Wheels economy. And the way I describe that is that if you're a kid, you may remember playing with Hot Wheels. Because of those orange tracks, you could run your car much faster than if you ever did trying to run it over your carpet at home. The great thing about Hot Wheels is that you could run the car fast. You could do loop de loops. It could, fly and from one track to another. Really cool stuff. The problem with Hot Wheels is that if your tracks were off just a tiny bit, the car would go right off the rails and go crashing into your mother's china cabinet. We're in a Hot Wheels economy. We can do things faster and faster than we ever could before. The trouble is that if you're off just a little bit, you crash more spectacularly than you ever did before. And so those are some of the challenges we have. How do we operate faster, but also, in a sense, less, not as dangerously as we might?
Where are where is the guardrails to help it?
Yeah, we need better guardrails. And we also have to be careful about when we go off the rails because, yeah, an example of this in one sense, it seems strange, but 2 years ago, lumber prices went through the roof. Construction supply companies made a lot of money. What did they do with that money? Especially after lumber prices went down spectacularly last year. I track revenues because people don't tell me about profit. But my suspicion is that profits went down hugely too, because if people ran their business successfully and saved the money that they made 2 years ago, theoretically that should cover some of the costs they had 1 year ago. But we'll see.
Interesting. Very cool. In your process to collect information, try to stay up on these things, what sort of things do you do to make sure you mentioned surveys, but what sort of things do you do, or where do you go to make sure that you kind of have the pulse of these things?
Yeah. Well, I actually spend multiple hours a day. Probably the majority of my working time is spent reading and looking at things, looking at reports, checking out things. I read so that you don't have to is sort of what a journalist does. I go to that meeting so you don't have to go to that meeting. And then I draw out of it the stuff that I think is most valuable. I go to a 2-day meeting and I come back with 8 ideas. And the 8 ideas take 3 minutes to read. But you don't have to spend 2 days then, attending the meeting. And that's largely, what I do. It's the collecting and then the compiling and then looking for the comparisons and contradictions out there. I and from a whole bunch of different places, be it conversations I've had or just things I've noticed on the street, and as well as reading reports, from Gallup surveys to what the shipping industry is talking about to you know uh, what the Boy Scouts may be doing.
Yeah, for sure. It's great. I love it. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, but you wanted to share?
Um, Not really, except that I also need BS detectors in my job because many people make claims, but I'm not always in a position to know whether what they're telling me is true or whether it's BS. So, I would just invite everybody to do two things. One is my website is Webb hyphen analytics.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter. But the other is I'm on LinkedIn. I'm posting things all the time. And I would love it if people would read stuff and then write to me and say, Craig, you're almost doing a disservice by writing about that. You know, don't you know that such and such is the way, it is? And that helps me because ultimately I become a better, more discerning collector of information, and I'm putting out more valuable information and less stuff that is not valuable.